It was so cold that nothing grew, and even when they wanted to plant in the spring, nothing grew. Everything was still frozen. And then it was accompanied by heavy rain and flooding. It was called the Year of the Great Frost.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
Like each successive peak is keep going lower and lower and lower on the multi-millennia when you're looking at 10,000 years of record, not just 40 years or 100 years. So again, there was all these kind of subtle points that were being made across the talk of not directly coming out and saying, this next one we're going to drop off a cliff, we're going to go way back into something super, super cold, way cold, unbelievable cold, like, more than 10,000 years ago cold. It was just like, hey, take a look at this chart. You notice each successive heat spike is diminishing as we move down the timeline. See, I said the exact same thing to you, but I told you in two different ways, the exact same set of information. Solar magnet field and the terrestrial climate. And this is on the Global Warming Policy Forum, GWPF website. And also there's another nugget down in there about cosmic rays as well you might want to check out if you have the time. So anyway, the next grand solar minimum beginning, like we'll be in the full throes of it by 2020, and it'll just amplify from that point forward. There's this stark difference in the messaging at this moment. I've been following this stuff for years, and I've never heard these level of people talk like this ever. Never. Piers Corbyn, he comes out, he'll throw it around, he mixes the politics with the climate. But these highest level people coming now out openly talking about this, something has definitely just changed. In the messaging that's allowed to be spoken, I guess, perhaps from high on above said, hey, let the message go. Now's the time to let the people get ready. They got less than 9 years. Maybe 9 is a sacred number, and maybe that was the TikTok number that was needed. Maybe they had to backtrack and say, all right, when we do all the 9s, like September 9th, 2018, they get 9 years to prepare something like this. Numerologically, numerically, numerology, the occultists are so deep into. I'm on SOT.net, another aggregator which is well worth your time. They go through quite a few different topics, what might interest you, how they're all overlapping at the moment. So I want to start this article here. Europe's little ice age, all things which grew above the ground died and starved. This comes out of the National Post. Author is Sam White. He's talking about in the beginning of the 1600s, late 1606, early 1607, first Englishmen were sailing over to Jamestown. And then the weather in Europe turned eerily warm and dry in parts of Germany. Flowers bloomed in February. And it seemed that there was no winter at all for several years. And then decades of cold. Now wait, where have I seen or heard this exact phrase mentioned? Oh, the last few years in the news of your current era. They talked about the sudden change. It was warm and no winter at all, and then suddenly the next year, bam, it flipped. They kind of plunged back into some of the worst cold in generations, and by that time the winter of 1607 and 8 had gone down in Europe as one of the great winters. Well, the forecasters are calling a great winter this year as well, plunging into the Arctic temperatures for Europe. Rivers were frozen solid. The ground lay under sheets of ice. animals, livestock, trees, everything perished. And he's like, he even quotes here, birds froze to death. It was a winter who was like any unheard of in human history. You have to think about that. So what kind of history did they have in the let's say 1608? What type of real written history would you have had in 1608 to gauge or measure by as being one of the greatest in human history? Did they still have text, etc., from the church in, say, the Wolf Minimum, 1300s, late 1300s? Would they have had anything from the 800 AD era, Ort Minimum? Would they have had recollections of records from around 79 AD or 430 BC? I mean, really, what kind of records were they using and comparing when they made this statement? You know, for us, we have a catalog of centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries of cataloged human recordings, if you will, millennia of these. Now, for us to draw on and say it was unlike any unheard of in human memory or human history would be a greatly different statement when they were talking at their time in the 1600s. But whatever it was called the Year of the Great Frost. It began a little before Christmas and it continued until mid-spring. It was so cold that nothing grew, and even when they wanted to plant in the spring, nothing grew. Everything was still frozen. And then it was accompanied by heavy rain and flooding early in the winter that gave way to ice. So these are the types of accounts you would look for, and then you would see, are there any matchups going on with what we're seeing currently, like the record cold and the record snow in Germany? How about all the record snow across all the Alps, France, Spain, Italy? And again, they didn't have really good communication to talk to Morocco in those days and saying, hey, you guys in Morocco, are you getting record snow down there? It's super cold up here. We got like 7 months of frost. You know what was happening in the exact same parts of the world at the exact same time? I'll tell you what was happening in China. The Ming Dynasty collapsed at that time due to, you got it, they weren't able to grow enough food. We could start to see what happened in Thanksgiving. Holidays were established. You know, when they arrived there, they couldn't grow anything, and they had to beg Native American Indians to take them in so they would not have all perished, frozen, and starved to death. They did bring them in. This is where Thanksgiving comes from, but that was the beginning of the end for the kindness. But this is during the exact same time. So we know we have written records and records that happened on North America, that happened in Europe, and it also happened over in Asia. All the same event encompassing the entire Northern Hemisphere, verified through all these written accounts. Now, see, that's what you need to do, is dig back in time and do this for, different parts of the planet and talk about their crop losses, etc. So you got to think, without just-in-time delivery, and if they didn't grow anything for those 2 years, what do you think the prices of the food would have been? I have an answer for you, because I did study this. I went back and I took a look at the barley and the wheat prices in central Germany and France from the 1600 to 1700 AD. Now, what they found was, it was actually a study done by a couple universities, so I just put these two papers together and then just they had more information with two sets of paper. The price of the food would quadruple during the bad harvest years, like 1608, 1609, 1610. It started to get a little better, but during these times, the price quadrupled. That's if you could get it, because sometimes it's unavailable, and the only way that you could get it was by marrying into a family or some other type of trade that was needed. Like money didn't work part of the time, but it did at some time. The minimum pricing was 4x, but then when they had good harvest seasons, that it didn't stay at 4x, it just dropped right back to probably the regular price, plus or minus, plus 10%, something like this. It was really interesting, and then they would go for several years, and the prices would be stable at what they were used to before, plus, like say 10%, a little bit more maybe. And then they would get into another bad harvest year, whoosh, instantly 4x up. Now, some of these would be multi-year durations of where they couldn't plant. This is when they started to get into the population migrations. People moved continents. This is when wars started between the powers of trying to go find food-growing areas, trying to get the people creating unrest out of their cities by sending them to war. So again, you got to look at history book. What's going to happen now? The lowest part of the segment of population is not going to be able to afford food by 2020. I'm going to say 5. I'm going to definitely say we're not going to be waiting until 2028, probably 2023. There'll be all kind of crazy things happening with food pricing. The threads of society are going to be slowly unraveling from 2021 onward. But when we really get to the point where they can't eat, they're just going to cause a lot of trouble. And I don't blame them. I would want to eat too. And if you guys got the money, if you guys got food over there and you're holding it from me and you're just being greedy, that's not cool. I'm going to try to get your food. So you're going to have a lot of this going on. So the civil unrest, they have to do something with these people. Now, I'm not going to accept them being shot in the street. That's unacceptable. I will actually take action against stopping that happen. I don't want them shot. They're hungry. They're put in a situation. They're hungry. You got to feed them. Oh, no, we want to hold it. That's our money. That's our food, whatever. It doesn't work. You can't execute them in the street. So you're going to need to take them out of the problem-causing area somehow. Now, how would you do that? You need to redirect their anger. You need to redirect them, their bodies, into a different place so they're not causing a disturbance. What we saw in the repeat in the 17 and 1600s was their solution at that time was start a war and send the troublemakers over to the front lines. Just get them out of the city. Doesn't matter. Give them food and tell them they have to join. Once they're joined, tell them they'll have continuous food. And if they go win the war over there, they can take all their food and bring it back and feed their families. Imagine that choice given to you today if you're starving to death on the street and they say, we will give you food, we will house your family in here, and we will give them food as long as you go fight in a different country for whatever resource it might be. I really don't think it would take that long to fill an army to send them overseas. Given that choice of protecting your family and keeping them fed and out of danger, and you going and taking your body to a different place and not causing problems, I think they're just going to repeat the same playbook over and over again here. So you can start to see how this thing is going to unravel. There's so many facets of history overlapping into modern era, and it all is truly dependent on how intense this cycle is going to be. Because you got 60% of the people out there in this whole arena, let's say there's 100% of people in this whole sphere of the grand solar minimum, climate change, and all these things going on. 60% of them say we're going into something in the multi-thousand year cycles for sure, possible full-on blown glaciation and everything in between. So there's everything from full-blown glaciation down to like 3,600 year, 2,000 year events. The other 40% of the people saying, 400 year, something like this. So the effect on the society and how fast everything is going to unfurl and how fast you're going to have to stay ahead of these changes determines on how fast this thing and how deep the cycle truly is. Now, by 2020, you'll have a very good absolute peg on how intense this cycle will be. Because through these next 2 years, if we blow through any of the previous benchmarks, then you'll know we're going into something well above just a 400-year set of circumstances. And at that point, your mind should start shifting as well into what was thought of survivability and adaptability into a 400-year event now needs to turn into adaptability of a multi-thousand-year event, which means gargantuan shifts in everything, the way our societies and governments, economy move. And how can you stay ahead of that? Well, you need to look back into history and some of the greatest calamities and see how people actually moved. There's always opportunity in the danger, right? Always. You can always find a niche in there. How do you help people? How do you provide value? But the whole thing is about getting a timeline on it so you can stay ahead, protect yourself. And at the same time, if you got the timeline, you can look out with your crystal ball and see where the needs will be for this value that you can provide to the society. And you're just not going to skate through and be like, hey, I'm just going to cruise through. And no, you're going to have to be giving value and help, progressing the society, moving it forward. But you have to see where it's going so you can jump in front of the wave. Like Wayne Gretzky was a perfect example. I don't know if you followed hockey for a little while in my younger days. But Wayne, one of the greatest hockey players ever, would always say, I would always skate to where the puck will be. And Kelly Slater, also one of the greatest surfers of all time, was that 7-time world champion, 8-time world champion. He would say the same thing. I'm always surfing to where the wave is going to be, where the wave is going to evolve. That's where I'm surfing. He wasn't surfing where he was at the next place where it would be. And again, these two had the exact same mind frame of seeing where it would be in advance and always being in that right spot. The same, it's just as true with this. If you see the intensity of the cycle, if you know what the changes will be, you can position yourself to be right in the right place, to be able to help others the most, and thrive during your time but you have to know what's going to happen. You need the timeline. Again, I'm trying to put these timelines together with this newest of information that I have available at my fingertips. It's going to scare a lot of people. It's going to wake up a lot of people. It's going to give a lot of people a crystal ball into the future. And I really want to try to intertwine with not just the weather events that are happening, but the society repercussion events. That's the most important. I could talk to you until I'm blue in the face about it snowed here, it rained extra here, whatever. Those are just indicators of these greater cycles in play and how they're going to affect our society. That's kind of what I want to put together is a blueprint moving forward of what do you think is going to happen in 2019, 2020. I'm going to try to lay it out year by year on how intense I think the cycle will get, along with the civil disturbances, how the media is going to distract, the possible population migration, and also the economic declines and the food price increases, along with some of the commodities all mixed in per year moving forward until the black years of 2028, where it doesn't even really matter at that point. You'll either have been ready or you won't be. And that's going to be true for a lot of the population. Like, there's going to be almost 80% that won't even consider getting ready until they're knocking at your door for food. There's going to be a lot of changes mentally going through this whole thing. Again, when is the mind shift going to flip to your more self-survival, their self-survival? I don't know. There's going to be a lot of changes in what's considered kindness. As I see the future moving forward, when we get into 2020, forward into 2021, 2022, grain shipments and grain futures as we purchase them today will change form. Each area that grows grain will have its own specific offering to the highest bidder through an ICO. The ICOs, as we know today, are traditionally companies trying to get funding, and they launch, and then they put their token or coin out onto the market after they finish with their ICO. But ICOs are going to absolutely change in the future. This is the reason smart contracts and secret contracts are being pushed out through Enigma. Let's talk about Kansas Wheat, for example. So Kansas Wheat will issue its own ICO for the Kansas Wheat 2022 harvest. You're going to have to buy that ICO to take delivery of the wheat. I do believe that the ICO will be issued in either bushels or it will be issued in barges. And as a company or a manufacturer or an individual, you will need to purchase tokens in an ICO that equal the equivalent amount of grain. Then it's on the blockchain, and then it verifies who the owner is. And once delivery is taking place, it's going to go to a central repository, and this food is going to be loaded into lockers unless you're an institutional customer. I'm talking more on the individual side. You'll input your code with a barcode through a smartphone, and then that locker will unlock and you will be allotted your food. Your food will come out of there and you'll be able to get it. The way we're working today, you go to a supermarket and then you just buy your food. In the future, when food is incredibly scarce and incredibly expensive and it becomes the most valuable commodity on our planet, you're going to have to prepay for it. ICOs are the way you're going to need to buy your food in the future, specifically for manufacturers. You as an individual, perhaps you'll have to buy an ICO issued by the buyer of the wheat that bought the Kansas ICO. I'm not sure how it's going to work there, but I'm just more on the institutional side. 60,000 tons of wheat broken down into barges and then fragmented and broken down again into bushels. Governments can trade. Companies can trade. At this point, if there's a mechanism for them with smart contracts and ICOs to facilitate and guarantee payment. Because around 2022 or 2023, the banking system, as you know, it won't exist anymore. It just won't. There still has to be a mechanism and a medium for trade. And this is why I say they need all of this set up before the food losses really hit our planet. This is why these two sets of circumstances are intertwined like DNA strands moving forward. The intensification of the weather from the grand solar minimum, wiping out the crops, and also a mechanism for us to still trade and you to eat. Because governments understand, I really don't know how maybe ineffectual they are, but certainly they have very bright minds working for them. Consultants that are going in and, think tank I talk to, these are some of the brightest minds on the planet. These people are very, very smart. Governments know what's coming, and also governments have history books, and they know what happens when people get hungry. And they also know that a population cannot go down to zero, and you cannot rely on everybody taking the steps to go back to a pioneering lifestyle and taking care of themselves. There's like 2% of the population that even knows what's happening at the moment. There's less than 1% who knows what's happening with cryptocurrency. And the other 98% of people are just going to be, they're going to have to be led, let's say that. Governments know that the population can't crash to zero because then they no longer have a country, they no longer have a workforce, and they can no longer rebuild anything, including infrastructure and economy. They also understand people need to eat because hungry people overthrow governments. Hungry people do strange things. Hungry people kill people. Hungry people do nasty things, and they're uncontrollable. And the psychological profiling that goes on as individuals, this response will force them to do this action. That's been well documented for hundreds of years. So they know the response pattern of stimulus on a human and what they're going to do next based on, there's 25 possible outcomes due to this stimulus response. Great. So they already know the playbook, what'll happen, how you're going to react pretty much on everything except food shortages and starvation. So governments are going to have to continue the food supply. They're going to have to continue ways for farmers and companies to get supplies to still grow food, such as fertilizers, seeds, machinery repair parts, fuels. There has to be a mechanism for all this to continue for at least basic minimal. I understand the populations are going to decline drastically, and that's just not, I'm not even talking about that. The people who are left still have to. They're going to have to grow their own food. That's going to be part of it. But, you can't grow your own wheat enough to supply you for a full year. You're going to need an enormous amount of land for that. And these industrial scale farms, I hate to say it, but they're necessary in today's world for at least industrial production and industrial size scale of wheat. Local community probably could get together if a few people have tractors, and if they have available farmland, they could grow enough for their local community. But outside of that, most people aren't willing to take those preparations or even think like that. Most people are, they're living in some sort of world where they don't even know how to repair a thing. You got to realize how many people today don't even know how to repair a single thing, let alone improvise something, or let alone get their hands dirty or try new things that they haven't tried before. And they're addicted to computers and they're addicted to medicines. And there's so many things that it's going to be a difficult transition to pull people from this old world we exist in now into the new world. But the people who are still pulled in and do survive and do thrive and do want to enter this new world that we are going into, there's going to have to be mechanisms for survival set in. This ICO pre-purchase thing for our grain crops is going to keep the food moving. But you're going to have to understand what an ICO is, and you're going to have to understand how companies are going to adopt to this, and you're going to have to understand how they're going to be using these kind of different contracts and how this runs on the blockchain and how the governments are preparing to issue sovereign tokens and how all this is wrapping up into one single package, which puts it right on my same timeline of everything falling apart by 2020 and 2021 when the world truly wakes up to what's happening.